everyone, welcome back to the course Energy Resources, Economics and Sustainability. In the past few classes, we have been discussing the issue of global change, and specifically in the last class, we have been discussing the different international agreements, treaties, protocols that were brought in specifically to counter this very important issue of global climate change. But we also see that this particular issue has been spun around with many myths. We have been talking about this specific issue in the popular literature. We would have many social media talking about it, bringing it with the pros and the cons. Some still think that global climate change is not a reality, it's just propaganda. And then there is another community as well who tends to intensify the effects of global climate change as it is a doomsday that is approaching. So let us try to focus on this class to have a balanced opinion between the different myths that have been roaming around this important issue. Further, the myths have also gained a lot of importance because it is one of the issues that has implication in terms of the global treaties, the environmental threats, as well as the economic and social repercussions that are linked to it. We see that we have different scientists, politicians, economists, and people in the media talking a lot about it. And not everyone who talks about this important issue is having a scientific understanding of the underlying phenomena. And this is what we'll try to focus in the current class. We'll try to have a balanced opinion about the different myths that or the different kinds of statements that we keep on reading about or that is related to the global climate change. And we'll try to analyze these statements from a scientific point of view. And let's go through these statements one by one. So one of these basic statement that we keep on hearing is that there is no global warming per se. It's basically a small climate change. The global temperature has always been changing in the history, and it's basically a solar activity that keeps on changing. Well, there is truth to this. The solar activities does have a phenomena that keeps on that increases the radiation of the sun and the earth's temperature, and this particular phenomena typically has a cycle of 22 years. So as you can see on the graph on the left, and what you see in the yellow is basically the solar irradiance and how it has been oscillating in the past century or so. There has been ups and downs in terms of the solar irradiance that enters the surface of the earth, and this is also very nicely coupled with the temperature it would bring in. So if this particular phenomena was to be there, there would be oscillations in the temperature, ups and downs. But if you specifically see the temperature rise that has been happening for the past 70-80 years or so, it has had an upward trend. And this is no more an oscillation that would be triggered by a solar activity, which is in the form of oscillations. So of course, there is truth that the solar activity or the radiations that enter into the Earth's surface have been oscillating, and this affects the temperature of the Earth. But if we see the temperature data for the past century, it has been more or less rising, and it has been rising continuously. And this particular rise is very nicely correlated with the use of fossil fuels. It started with the onset of the industrial revolutions, and it has been nicely correlated with the increasing economic development that has been happening in the major parts of the world. Another statement that we might be reading or seeing is that in the recent 3 years or so, the data shows that there is no global warming. Temperature has been almost constant, and again, there is some truth to this. There have been span of a few years when there was a stagnation in the temperature of the world. So if you see the graph in front of you, we see that there have been years, specifically the years around 1910 or around 1914, when there was a stagnation or even reduction in the global temperature. Further, we see that the temperatures around 1960s to 1970s again were stagnant, and in some years there was a reduction as well. But again, climate change or the temperature rise is a very long term phenomena. and it should be looked with that lens. And if we see over the whole of the century, say if we consider the data how it has been changing from the 1880s or the 1900s since till the very past, till around 2020s, we see there has been an increase, and a better estimate of this increase could be an average of maybe 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, and that in that data we see there has been a continuous increase. So if we see the temperatures, it has had a continuous increase, and of course there have been periods of stagnation or even reduction that might be there for 2 to 3 years or 5 years, but even after that span of 5 years is over, there is again a rise, and many of these reductions or stagnation could be attributed to the global phenomena such as El Ninos, La Ninas, which are basically the movement of the ocean currents that affect the global temperatures. But over a long term, there has always been, or in the past century, there has been a consecutive rise in the temperature of the planet Earth. Further, there can be statements like, how can we have global warming? Like just in the month of maybe December or January, I went to a nearby hill station. Take for example Mussoorie. It was covered with snow. I played with the snow. We made snowmen and did all sort of enjoyment. Had there been a global warming, how could I be seeing snow there? Now here we should bring in the difference between weather and climate. So we should refer to the earlier discussion that we have, that weather is a short-term phenomena, whereas climate is a long-term phenomena, that is what we are more interested in. Even if there was a global temperature rise of say a few degrees Celsius, it wouldn't mean that there would be no snowfall happening in Mussoorie or any of the North Indian states, say Kashmir, Uttarakhand, Himachal. There are going to be snow days, there are going to be snow blizzards, no one is stopping that, but the overall the average temperature is going to rise. That is what we mean. It is not that there is going to be no snowfall as such. So the phenomena might reduce, might become lesser as we proceed in the future, but still there are going to be few days when the place is going to experience snowfall or a cold climate. Then there could be some kind of accusations or statements like the global temperature data are incorrect. We need several decades of data to draw accurate results. There might be conclusions that the observations that have been made on the temperature rise span to only a few decades, and if you look at the accuracy has been good only for the recent few years, and so we don't yet have a good amount of data to make conclusions that the global temperature is indeed rising. It is reaching a few levels which might have serious consequences, and this is what these are the type of statements people will be making. But if we consider the different types of global climatic models that are available by the different leading labs of the world, they are all in agreement, and they have more than 95% confidence that there is indeed an atmospheric temperature rise, and the temperature for the 20th century has indeed increased from somewhere between 0.55 to 0.67 degrees Celsius. So there is a complete agreement on the increase in the temperature that is happening, and this has been in agreement by the different leading labs of the different countries. So most of them agree that the data that we have been collecting is quite apt. The models that they have been relying on are quite robust. Of course, there are inefficiency in any models. So there is a popular statement that goes in that says that essentially all models are wrong, but some models are useful. So given that, if we point out the inaccuracy of any model, we can find that, but the models have been useful in coming up with useful output in the creation of scenarios to understand how the problem of global climate change is progressing and how the different types of intervention can help deal with these kinds of analysis. Further, there could be another statement which says that it has been an understanding with the rise in the global warming, there would be an increase in intensive weather events like hurricanes, and we see a lot of hurricanes that have been happening in the past 2 decades. Some examples could be Katrina, Amphan, Hudhud, Irma, and and a lot of time these hurricanes or the destruction that the hurricanes have been causing has been attributed to the global warming. And so if we reduce the CO2 buildup in the atmosphere, then these disasters will stop. Well, we need to correct ourselves. We need to understand that hurricanes have been there for many centuries. We have been hearing about extreme weather events for many centuries, and at that point there was no global warming coming into being. There was no fossil fuels being used, but still the extreme weather events were occurring. It's only that the intensity or the frequency of these events have increased with the introduction or with the increase of the climate change or the global warming problem. So even if we go back to the pristine environment maybe 200 years back or so, it is not that there will be no more hurricanes. These hurricanes are a weather phenomena that will keep on happening. It's only the intensity which has been aggravated because of the extreme weather conditions might subside, and we might see less of these events happening. But it's not that these events will stop happening all of a sudden if we have zero CO2 emissions or something similar. Then there could be another statement that in India, we can simply solve the problem of global climate change, and what we have to do is put a small tax on the coal industry. We already have something called as a coal cess, and so we just tax it, the coal industry, to some level, and this would mean that the renewables become at par with the coal based power, and people will adopt and the renewable power, and it's very easy in that sort. Well, it's very easier said than done. Like the amount of CO2 that is coming out from this typical coal-based power plants is very huge. Even today in India, more than 50% of the electricity that we are generating is coming from coal-based power plant. And the shift from coal-based power plant to a renewable-based power is not going to happen in a very quick fashion. It is going to take its own time, and a small tax would be appreciable, might help in accelerating the transition to a bit, but it's not going to change things much. Because as such, not many policies have a coal tax. In India, recently there have been talks about the carbon trading systems, and it's expected to come up quite nicely in the future, but the intricacies of these carbon trading systems are still to be looked into. I would also like to point you people to a similar study that we did for the transportation sector in India, wherein we tried to see what would be the carbon tax that would be needed to make the transportation sector to be net zero. Now, transportation sector itself has its own integrities, like there are options like EVs or hydrogen vehicles, that might be easier to implement as compared to others. When I say easier, it's in terms of like it's very hard to decarbonize the marine sector or the air sector. The aeroplanes and the big cargo ships that we are running are very difficult to be run on green power, and if we would have to shift to cleaner fuels for these two particular sectors, it would also entail a good amount of carbon tax. So we did an analysis and tried to understand what would be the range of carbon tax that would be needed for achieving these kind of transition, and it happened like for a complete net zero transportation sector, we would have a very high carbon tax of more than like $1,000 per ton of CO2. And just for comparison, the normal carbon credits that you get for trading a ton of carbon somewhere around $20 or so. In the developed world might be $50 or so. So the carbon tax that would have to be put in to bring in the complete decarbonization of any particular sector might have very high values. Further, there are other statements like stabilizing the world's climate will require high income countries to reduce their emissions by 60 to 90% from the 2006 levels by 2050. Of course, that is a welcome step, and this is what they are expected to do as well, but it cannot happen and that it's only the high income countries making all the transition. I would just want to point you towards the example that we did in the last class, where we saw that if the countries like US or Canada were almost reducing their emissions by half, and we were increasing the emissions of countries like India and Indonesia to almost close to world average, still there would be a drastic increase in the CO2 emissions. Further, we need to also understand that in the absence of the technological breakthroughs that might happen in the renewable energy resources, such energy reductions that if that happens in the near future would cause the economies of high income countries to have a very heavy penalty, and and the citizens of these so-called high-income countries might not be able to maintain their high-income status, which they are currently doing, and there are going to be difficulties for the world to agree to a common strategy, and this is a cause of concern, and that is what calls for all the countries of the world to come together to tackle this important issue of climate change. Then there are also some kind of statements being made that the consumer will benefit from the cheap electrical energy from fossil fuel. Cheap electrical energy when the fossil fuels are replaced by solar or wind power. So yes, we have seen great amount of economic progress that have been happening in the solar and the wind energy in many parts of the world, and also in India. We can see that direct solar and wind energy production happens to be sometimes cheaper than the electricity that is produced from fossil fuel in terms of coal. That is again a truth, but overall if we see, we can see the graph on the left hand side. With the increase in the percentage of renewables, we also see an increase in the electricity price that has been noticed by the different countries of the world. And this is specifically because these sources of energy like solar or wind are not available round the clock, which means they have to be stored. There are going to be seasons when they are going to perform much better, and there are going to be some time periods where the production is not going to be up to the mark. And what would you do when the production is not up to the mark? Specifically, you would have to go for some kind of storage mechanisms. And when the storage is brought into being, the prices of the electricity that you would use is expected to increase in a very high manner. And so it's the cost that we would have to pay for reliability. So coal, natural gas based power has been used as a major form of energy because it was one of the reliable source of energy. It didn't had a change that is happening on day or night or with the seasonal change, whereas that's not the reality with solar and wind. And if we go towards the different types of storage mechanisms, there are going to be additional cost. So we did this analysis for specifically for India, and we tried to analyze the different types of grid based storage systems for India, which included the lithium ion batteries, the pump storage, the thermal energy storage, the vanadium flow batteries, and compressed air systems. And our estimates that we derived was like this cost of storage in terms of per unit of electricity in kilowatt hour could range somewhere between 3.5 rupees to 10 rupees of extra. So if the solar is producing electricity at say 3 rupees a unit, and if you would have to store some units, the stored energy would cost you around 13 rupees or so if you are going for batteries, and it could be a bit lesser if you go for other types of energy storage. But these are some of the estimates that we have tried to derive, and of course some of these are hypothetical cases as well, but there is a significant energy penalty that you would have to pay if you would have to go for reliable renewable energy. Then there is another statement that has been put that says that we should all plant trees to offset the carbon footprint. As the normal understanding goes, the trees would be taking in CO2. The carbon is captured by the tree for the production of biomass, and the oxygen is released back into the atmosphere. If we go, let us try to do a simple calculation to understand this particular pathway, and let's go to the whiteboard to make a simple calculation. So suppose I take into account a fully grown pine tree. So pine trees are the tall trees that you find in the mountainous regions, and the typical dimensions of the tree that I take in is around 50 feet tall, a considerable height, around 12 inch of trunk diameter, and around 30 feet of canopy. If I take a typical tree like this, which has a 30 feet of canopy and 50 feet tall, and the typical weight of this particular tree is going to be around 900 kgs, a fully grown tree, and this is expected to have or store around 360 kgs of carbon, considering it will have almost 40% of the carbon, the rest being oxygen and hydrogen. So this is the normal formula, And this particular kgs of carbon, if I multiply that with 44 and divide by 12 in its potential to produce CO2, this has the potential to basically sequester around 1320 kgs of CO2. So, I am taking another typical pine tree, weight is around 900 kgs, and it is going to sequester around 1320 kgs of CO2 during its growth to the present weight. And if I consider the year 2022, the total emissions globally were 37,000 billion kgs. So, these were the global emissions, and if I would have to offset just half of these emissions by planting more trees, so that would, we just divide the total emissions by the capacity of a single tree, and this would approximately require around 14 billion trees, and the area that would be required for planting all these trees would be roughly 3,50,000 kilometers square, and this is the emissions for 1 year. So, this amount of area is roughly equal to the area that is basically acquired, or that is for a country like Germany or Finland. And if you want to see for India, like the largest state of India, that's Rajasthan, has an area of almost this range, around 3,47,000 kilometers square. So, you would need area of the size of Rajasthan every year if you would want to sequester half of the total CO2 emissions that are happening globally. So, of course, planting trees does have its own benefits. It is an activity that should be encouraged, but we also need to be realistic that the potential that the growing of future trees have in curbing or sequestering the CO2 emissions that we have on a global level. If you go back to the slides. So, we just need to understand that there is not enough space available for this particular option. Then there are also sayings that we use a lot of CO2 products in our lives. A typical example could be the carbonated beverages that we drink, or another example could be in the urea that we use in the as a fertilizer. They all need CO2 for their manufacturing, and the annual consumption, and if we use these, if we capture CO2 and use them in these products, possibly we can curb the CO2 emissions. But again, here again we need to understand what the reality is. The global emissions, as we have discussed, are of the tune of around 37,000 million tons. So, this is the global CO2 emissions, whereas all the consumption of CO2, that be it for the direct use in terms of the carbonated drinks or the enhanced oil recovery, or for the manufacture of different plastics or minerals, are somewhere around 50 to 60 million tons. So, again there is an order of magnitude difference here. So, what we can utilize, the amount of CO2 that we can utilize for our activity is somewhere around 0.16%. So, even not 1% of the CO2 that is being generated we can use for our day-to-day activities. So, we need to be realistic in this case. Another argument that has been put in, like there are many options, and one particular option is regenerative agriculture, where the aim is to keep the field covered, so the topsoil losses are not much. There could be some carbon sequestration that is happening, and further because the carbon, because the roots of these crops are within the soil, and after the crops are harvested, the roots tend to be in the soil, and there is some kind of sequestration that is happening. Of course, this is a good practice, should be encouraged. Different kinds of green agriculture or organic agriculture, permaculture, regenerative agriculture should be encouraged, but we should be realistic about the ability of these particular pathways in curbing the global CO2 emissions. Of course, they do sequester a small part of CO2, but as compared to the total CO2 emissions that are happening because of the anthropogenic activities, their potential is quite small. Then there is another a myth which says, like we should not rush to take any measures about CO2 because scientists still disagree on the global warming. Well, there have been saying that there are a lot of scientists who say that global warming is a myth. Well, if we see a majority of the scientific committee, they are in agreement that it's no longer a myth. There are scientific observations, and there has been more than 95% acceptance that global warming in itself is a reality. So we should go with the majority of the scientific community, and that which accepts that global warming is not a fake news, but is something real that all of us are facing. Another statement that you might come across would be the number of polar bears in the Arctic region are increasing, and so how can the global warming be real? Well, to some extent, the number of these animals are increasing, but we also need to be realistic that because of the global warming, the area of the land of the Arctic is also continuously reducing in terms of ice, which also means there is going to be a loss of habitat for these particular animals, specifically the polar bears. And there have been studies which suggest that there could be a loss of around 30% of the populations of polar bears just because of the effects of global warming. So, of course, the numbers of animals might be increasing because of certain aspects which are being brought in by the different types of rules or different types of agreements. But if we see the long term effects, that might have detrimental effects in some of the species of life. Further, an exaggeration to this particular aspect could be animal will adopt to climate change. Well, this is not a truth, this is a reality. This is something we all understand, that the different forms of life have been very good in adapting to the features, but the problem is that not each and every organism will be able to adapt. It's only going to be the survival of the fittest. There are going to be many significant population among a particular species who will not be able to adapt and might not be able to have a good future. So, something similar to the polar bears, it's not that the polar bears are going to get extinct, but the survival is going to reduce their number, and something similar can be expected for the other species of life as well. But as the saying goes on, like the life is going to go on, it's going to adapt to the different new climate, but again it's going to have serious consequences. The people would have to face different hardships. There is going to be economic penalties or the social penalties that people would have to pay. But over the whole, it's not something, it's like a doomsday that everything is going to finish. It's not going to happen that day, but it's going to lead to different problems which might impact us in economically, environmentally, socially. So, with this we have tried to discuss some of the major myths and realities that we keep on reading in the popular literature or the news, and we have tried to gain an understanding of these some of these statements. With this we take a break for the current class. Thank you.